I just wanted to say welcome. I will introduce myself in a minute, but I'm Rachel Neurath. Use the pronouns she, her, and I'm going to read a land acknowledgement and then we'll get started. So we are gathered on the unceded lands of Massachusetts and Pawtucket peoples. We acknowledge that this land on which we live, work, and garden is ancestral land that has been inhabited and stewarded by Indigenous peoples for thousands of years before any settlers arrived. They continue to live and thrive on the land that was forcibly taken from countless leaders, communities, and elders. Let us honor the enslaved people who built the wealth and foundation of Lincoln and who did not have ownership or equal access to it. As inhabitants and stewards of this landscape, we commit to sustaining and supporting the natural life and all living beings of this place. We commit to working towards healing and reconciliation amongst all people. We commit to learning more about the Indigenous peoples of this land and their history, and to supporting Indigenous-led organizations. With immense love and gratitude for this place we call home, we will do our part in bringing together greater healing for all peoples, for all landscapes, and for all beings, and for all future generations who will live here. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining tonight. And I am very excited to be here on the first day of fall, starting to finally feel kind of crisp and cool outside. And it seems like a good time to start thinking about, when the leaves are falling, what to do with your leaves. And I'm hoping that after hearing this sort of introduction to what is Leave the Leaves all about, and also a bit of a conversation on soil and climate benefits, that you might reconsider some of the traditional ways that we deal with our leaves in the fall. My name is Rachel Neurath. I use the pronouns she and her. And I am part of Lincoln Common Ground, which is part of Mothers Out Front Lincoln, along with Emily Hazlett, who's here, and she and Bryn Gingrich are going to, from the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, are going to be on to answer any questions in the chat while I'm talking. So feel free to type anything into the chat, and there will be time for questions at the end. So at the end, we'll unmute and you can go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll mention that again and ask questions. But while I'm talking, feel free to put any questions into the chat. This talk is also in collaboration with the Lincoln Garden Club, who's also thinking a lot about Leave the Leaves this fall, and the Codman community farms, who have been part of our collaboration on healthy soils. So why would you leave the leaves in the fall when they fall to the ground? There are lots of good reasons. One is to support wildlife. There is a huge array of wildlife who need those leaves for shelter, for food, a place to overwinter. They replenish plant nutrients. They increase soil health. They increase water retention, so how much water the soil can hold, and they store carbon. And so I'll be talking about all of those benefits. And Leave the Leaves is a growing movement. It's not just us saying that this is a great idea. Even the US Department of Agriculture now says that it's a great idea to leave the leaves to benefit nature. The National Wildlife Federation, the Xerces Society, Wild Seed Project, Mass Audubon, Grow Native Massachusetts, and so many more are really advocating for Leave the Leaves. So we are joining in Lincoln with this growing movement to encourage people to leave the leaves. And so I guess for me as a scientist, I think, kind of zooming back, well, why would you leave a leaf? What's in a leaf? So when a leaf falls, it is full of water at first. It's going to dry out, but it has water. It is full of carbon-rich compounds like cellulose, lignin, proteins, lots and lots of carbon compounds. It has macronutrients that plants need, like nitrogen and phosphorus, and micronutrients that plants need as well, like iron and zinc. And so if we think about the chemical benefits of leaving the leaves, when the leaves fall, the leaf mulch returns those essential nutrients, that nitrogen, that phosphorus, the iron and zinc and all those other nutrients to the soil that the plants are really relying on. They need that cycling back into the soil after they grow and drop their leaves. The other really important thing that the leaves are bringing is what's called organic matter, which is decomposing carbon-rich compounds derived from living material. And that is really critical for soil, and it helps restore soil health, and it helps store carbon, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So plants will grow better if you leave your leaves, and the soil will be healthier if you leave your leaves. And this is a beautiful picture from Diana in town, who has Monarch Meadows, which is a new business that is helping people do native plantings and convert their lawns to wildlife habitats. And this is her yard, and she has left the leaves, and it looks beautiful in the fall. So the physical benefits of leaving the leaves, leaf mulch improves water retention and it moderates temperature. So having just that physical layer of leaves on the ground, this is one of the reasons why there's so much wildlife that lives there. It's going to keep it from getting too hot or too cold and keep it moist. And there are a lot of biological benefits. So this is, I love this poster that Healthy Yards put together, and it shows the huge array of insects, salamanders, turtles, birds, butterflies, that amphibians that rely on this leaf litter. And so they use it as shelter. The predators are looking for food there. It's a really, really important habitat for a lot of native insects, like native bees really need that leaf litter for the winter to survive. And then beyond leaves, stems, berries, and seeds are also really important as food and shelter for wildlife. So native bees will nest inside stems of plants that are left. Berries can be left for birds and small mammals. So this old concept of when it's fall, you just clear your yard and you take away the leaves and you cut down all the stems and you take away the old berries and the old seed heads, we're rethinking, because we're realizing that those are actually so important for the wildlife. And this is a beautiful photo from Robin Wilkerson showing the berries and the birds just flocking to them in the winter. A big concern is ticks when you leave the leaves, and leaves can be a place where ticks like to hang out. And so I understand that that's a concern. And I just want to point out that the other consideration is that you tend to have more ticks in these disturbed habitats. So when you have wilderness loss of biodiversity, and climate change, that's actually promoting more ticks. And when you have predators who will eat the ticks, then you have fewer ticks. And when you have leaves that are supporting a lot of those bottom of the food chain organisms, like the insects that these predators are relying on, you're going to have more predators. And so they're going to help keep that tick population in check. So I think it's important to think about the whole integrated ecosystem and the importance of biodiversity when we think about ticks, and how it's really important. One of the best things you can do is support biodiversity, and leaving the leaves is a way to do that. And I'm happy to talk more about that at the end in the questions. So my background is soil microbial ecology. So I think a lot about soil health, and a healthy soil. You can just see in this picture, this is a little bit extreme, but you can see the healthy soil on the left and the unhealthy soil on the right. And the healthy soil is dark and rich and a plant is growing in it. And on the right, it's dry and cracked and pale. It doesn't have the nutrients it needs. It's not holding the water that the plants need. It doesn't store carbon. So how do you get healthy soil? One of the ways is to add organic matter and nutrients back to the soil and replenish it. And leaves are one of the important ways to do that. So they add organic matter and essential nutrients to the soil, And in so doing, and also in creating that physical barrier, they help support a healthy soil microbial community. And just like people are talking a lot now about how important a healthy gut microbiome is for human health, a healthy soil microbiome full of a diverse array of fungi and bacteria is really important for soil health. And as we all know, our climate is changing, which makes this an even more pressing issue. So this is what our carbon cycle looks like right now, where we have carbon in the atmosphere, too much carbon in the atmosphere. We have carbon in the biosphere, so above ground plants and animals, carbon in the soil, which is a huge pool of carbon, carbon in the ocean, and then carbon in the fossil pool, which really should be staying down there and not being released, but it is being released. And that's one of the major drivers of our climate change that's happening right now, along with things like deforestation. And so what we hope for in the future is no more fossil fuels, that we can move away from fossil fuels. But unfortunately, the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels right now are so high that we also need a way to pull down some of that carbon and restore it back to where it's supposed to be. And so the biosphere and soil are one of the best places to draw down carbon and take it out of the atmosphere. And a great way to do that is by leaving the leaves and letting those leaves become part of that soil carbon pool. And there are lots of other ways to manage soil for more carbon storage. So thinking about this climate mitigation, so how to help draw down carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to help solve climate change. Leaves, as we talked about at the very beginning, contain carbon. And as they decompose, they become part of the soil. So they add more carbon to the soil. And soil stores carbon so it starts with the plants. So the plants absorb carbon dioxide from the air, and they convert that carbon dioxide into carbon-rich leaves, stems, and roots. And then that carbon enters the soil as soil organisms feed on the dead leaves and roots. And also the roots are releasing some carbon into the soil as they're growing. And that helps lock the carbon underground. Some of the carbon is released back to the air as carbon dioxide because those microbes, just like us, they'll breathe out CO2. But on balance, if you have a healthy system, you can be storing more carbon in the soil. The other thing we think about with climate change is climate resilience. So even if we're doing everything we should be to cut back on fossil fuels, store as much carbon as we can in the soil, we need to think about we're already dealing with more weather weirdness, more climate extremes. And so what can we do to have a more resilient ecosystem that can handle those fluctuations? And one really important thing is how much water can be stored in soil. If you have soil that can store a lot of water, then it's more resilient against drought, and it also is more resilient against flooding, because if it's more like a sponge that can hold a lot of water. And so for every 1% increase in organic matter on US cropland, you could store the amount of water that flows over the Niagara Falls in 150 days. So there's huge potential for increasing the water retention of soil, the ability to hold more water with more organic matter, which can come from things like leaves. And then the other thing is, again, going back to leaving the leaves supports biodiversity. The United Nations says, and I agree with them, that biodiversity is one of our strongest natural defense, is our strongest natural defense against climate change. It's really, really critical that we have biodiverse ecosystems to deal with climate change when we're thinking about the health of our ecosystems and how they're going to cope with our changing climate. We really need to have a high diversity of different species. And leaving the leaves, as Doug Tallamy, who is a well-known author, entomologist, and ecologist, says it's sort of the natural way things should be. It's taking a cue from nature, and it's really important, especially under trees, because a huge number of really important native insects overwinter as part of their life cycle in the tree that are under trees. And I recommend his writing if you haven't read it before. And so we kind of get to this idea of we're shifting away from our traditional view of what your lawn should look like and moving towards more of a holistic view of it's not just a lawn, it's a landscape. So before we had this American ideal of the pristine green grass and very manicured and no leaves on it. And that doesn't really do much for wildlife. And with the changing climate, it doesn't do very much for us. But if we can have a more ecological landscape, it can benefit us, it can benefit wildlife and the planet, and it can be incredibly beautiful. I think this is a Pete Udoff garden in Ireland, and it looks like a painting. So planting native plants, having diversity that supports wildlife is sort of a lot of people are saying that that's the hopeful future of what our lawns could be, is beautiful for us and beautiful for the planet. And here are some examples of what this looks like in Lincoln. So this is Robin Wilkerson's fall garden. And so we have berries and seed heads left for animals to forage over the winter. Beautiful fall colors of these thriving plants with leaf litter in between that's helping nourish them as they grow. And a lot of the leaves, sorry, I should go back. Robin said to me, you know, there are leaves here on the grass right now. In the spring, they're gone. They've blown away or decomposed. She doesn't have to, with a light leaf layer like that, she doesn't have to do anything with them. And here she's left stems so that native bees can burrow in and spend the winter there, and other insects can use it as habitat. And this is from Diana Rice's beautiful garden in fall. And it's a little hard to see, but there are leaves in between, nourishing the plants and giving a wonderful wildlife habitat. Here's some more pictures of the garden in fall. So I have a couple of tips, but I'm happy to answer again at the end any questions. One is that leaves can be mulched with a mower. So if you have a little bit of a thicker leaf layer on your grass and you're worried about it smothering the grass, or you are worried about ticks, mulching the leaves with a mower is an option. And that can really provide great nutrients. It breaks down a little faster, decomposes a little faster. It might not provide quite the same habitat for insects, but it still would be some habitat for the insects, and it can really help the plants grow. So you can put that onto your garden. If you're concerned about leaves on the grass, so say you live in a really woodsy area and you get a really thick layer of leaves and you are worried it's going to smother your grass, you can rake the leaves onto garden beds. And everyone I talk to says if they do that, the plants love it. They can grow through it. It works really well. You can add your leaves to your compost pile. They make a great brown contribution to your compost. And you can make leaf mold, and there are lots of tips online for how to make leaf mold, and that's also a great plant nutrient garden addition that you can add in the spring. And you'll notice before I said you could rake your leaves, and I'd really like to encourage everyone, if you can, to rake, because raking is much more eco-friendly than leaf blowing. If you're using a gas-powered leaf blower, then the pollution from 1 hour of leaf blowing is like 1,100 car miles. So they're really inefficient. And pollute a lot. And even if you have an electric leaf blower, it has such a forceful sort of blast that it really disturbs all the wildlife who are living below those leaves, and raking is much gentler. So I encourage you to try raking, or if you use a landscaper, ask them if they'll rake, or see if there's a high school student who will rake for you, and give that a try. Another tip is that stems, berries, and seeds can be left over winter. This is a picture that I took at Drumlin Farm last January, and they've left their sunflowers, and they've left some other stalks standing, which are great food and habitat for wildlife. Leaves left under the tree canopy are especially ecologically beneficial. So if you're not sure you're ready to jump all the way in, consider at least leaving your leaves under the trees, although it's great to leave them in more places too, but under the trees is a really important place for a lot of insects' life cycles to have that leaf litter to overwinter in. And you know your space and needs the best. Every yard is a little different and what you need might be a little different, but we really encourage you to give it a try. And I like this from the Xerces Society. They say neighbors may think you're crazy or just plain lazy, but the little guys know you're a real hero when you leave the leaves. And I think especially in Lincoln, I don't know that your neighbors will think you're crazy. And if you're worried about that, you can put up a sign to help educate people that it's intentional. You're not just forgetting to rake or leaf blow, but you're doing it to help, and it helps educate other people in case they might be curious to give it a try. And so with the signs, we're going to send out in a couple days a recording, and we'll have more information about where you can get signs from us. I think that we'll probably be putting them out at Codman Farm again is my guess, but we'll have more information on that coming up soon if you want a yard sign. You can also get them from places like the Xerces Society or make your own. And there's going to be the Garden Club has a fantastic talk coming up in November. So I just want to make sure that everybody knows to save the date for 7 p.m. on November 7th. It's going to be with Kathy Connolly on Leave the Leaves, Save the Stems. So this really is an introduction, and she's going to go much deeper, and I think it will be a fantastic talk. Also, if you care about climate change and are thinking about leaving the leaves because you care about climate, which I hope you do, I want to make sure that everybody knows that Lincoln now has a climate action plan. Lynn Smith wrote a great My Turn piece in the Lincoln Squirrel the other day. And I wanted to sort of reiterate the sentiment that the State of the Town is coming up on September 30th. And so this is a great opportunity to check out the climate action plan, think about it a little bit, and there will be people, I believe, from the Green Energy Committee around to answer any questions about it at the State of the Town. And this is a QR code will take you to the town page on the climate action plan, or you can just Google it. And another opportunity to take action is there's going to be a rally at the Massachusetts State House on October 2nd at 11 a.m. And again, there's information if you scan the QR code. And this is to take action against private jet expansion. And you can, if you scan it, read all about it, but there's a planned major private jet expansion at Hanscom that would be a major source of greenhouse gas pollution for a very small, very privileged population who fly private jets. And as we're all thinking about things like supporting wildlife and storing carbon and protecting the environment, this kind of goes against all of those things, this is one of the many steps that Lincoln and the state are taking to try to combat climate change. And actually, I should say, back to the Lincoln Climate Action Plan, a big part of that plan, along with things like electrification, are nature-based climate solutions, particularly for resilience as the town thinks about climate change. So leaving the leaves is an example of a nature-based climate solution. So thank you so much for coming and listening. Lincoln Common Ground has a website at www.lincolncommonground.com. I'm sorry, I didn't make a QR code for that one, but it's lincolncommonground.com. And so you can check out our website. And I would love to welcome any questions. We're going to take you off of mute, and you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to answer questions. And there's Bryn is here from LLCT, and lots of members of Lincoln Common Ground are here, and they can also help answer any questions you have. So thank you so much. Yeah, Bryn.
Well, thank you, Rachel. This is really fantastic. And I just allowed everyone to unmute so they can use the raise hand feature to get in line behind me. I have sort of, I don't know if this is not a good question to ask, but I was at the Mass Audubon. They had a Science of Fall webinar last night, and she said something really interesting, which was that the trees actually reabsorb a lot of nutrients back into sort of the main plant before they like create the little scar and then let the leaf fall off. So I was just wondering if you know like what percentage of the nutrients from the leaf are staying in the leaf and falling to the ground, and what's going back into the tree. I just think it's interesting. I still am very supportive of leaving the leaves, obviously.
That's such a good question. I wish I knew the answer. I'll have to go look that up. Yeah, I mean, definitely from a carbon perspective, and it definitely does return nutrients to the soil. I've read, I just can't think of the number, but you're right. Yeah, the tree does reabsorb a lot of nutrients. So it's not quite as nutrient rich as if it dropped its fresh leaves on the ground, but you wouldn't want to drop its fresh leaves on the ground. Yeah, that's a great question. If anyone has the answer, feel free to chime in or drop it in the chat. Oh, and I should say, I'm sorry too, when we send our follow-up email, we'll also include in, along with information on the signs, information on upcoming LLCT events this fall that you can look forward to. Yeah, Isabel.
Hi, I have trouble getting into the webinar, so I'm on my phone. I wanted to say what a great talk. It was really comprehensive and I really appreciated it. I think what I really liked was the whole idea that, you know, if you leave the leaves under your trees, then it also is a soft landing for any of the caterpillars and larvae. And I just thought you did a marvelous job just covering everything. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for using the term soft landing. That's a big Doug Tallamy term, an important one to think about. Thank you.
It looks like there's a question in the chat. Is there ever too much or too many leaves to leave in a garden bed?
That's a good question. I think it depends a little bit on the plants you're growing, and there are much more experienced gardeners on here with me. I know if you are worried about it's like a ton of leaves, and you're worried about the plant, you know, if it's a couple inches, I think it would be fine. If you're talking like a foot of leaves, you could think about making leaf mold or putting it in the compost and then adding it to the garden bed after. But if anyone else wants to jump on and give any tips on that. And then mulching also helps it decompose faster.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So I've been putting cardboard down and then putting my leaves on top of that. And they tend to stay kind of dry. The cardboard, I think, does a good job blocking the, you know, the grass from growing. But I've done it now. I've left them for like several years, and now I've got weeds growing in my leaves. So I was kind of wondering how, I guess I'm just going to cover them again. I don't know if there's anybody has any experience with, you know, cardboard and leaves, and then, you know, developing that area for planting.
Diana Rice, are you on? Do you have an opinion on that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's been sitting there for a long time, Isabel, and you were saying you have weeds coming up in it.
Yeah.
I would just layer over it again, and you could I mean, if you're ready to plant, depending on the extent of the weeds, you know, you could prepare. You could probably just prepare it to plant in next spring. Just add a little bit of compost, just cover up the weeds and smother them over the winter. If they're so excessive, you can't pull them out.
Yeah, it's that horrible weed that has the sticky seeds on it.
Oh,
okay. Yeah. It's like,
yeah, smother it.
Smother it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and if people aren't familiar with this, this is something that Lincoln Common Ground, and I know a lot of other groups in town like the Garden Club and LCT do too, is smothering with cardboard is a great way to deal with weeds or invasives, and doing what's called sheet mulching. And if you Google it, you can find a lot of information or talk to anybody in any of our groups about what sheet mulching is, but it's sort of gardening without digging into the soil. Instead, you're building up more and more organic matter, and cardboard's part of that process. And I see some questions in the chat about what is leaf mold, which is a great question. And that's it's not that dissimilar from compost, but it's just leaves. It doesn't have other material in it. And you can find some tips online for how to make it, but you basically just leave your leaves out until they decompose. And then I think because it has, then the fungi start to break it down, it's going to more quickly turn into nutrients for the plants. And it also has some microbial sort of dead bodies in it, which are going to make it more nutrient rich than just plain leaves. And there's a question about mulching leaves versus leaving whole leaves. And I am not an expert on this if anyone has any more tips, but my understanding is mulching, they're going to decompose faster because they're smaller. So you might get a little bit more of a quick nutrient boost, carbon boost to your soil. The downside might be that I would imagine that certain things particularly things like amphibians might prefer a whole leaf to a mulched leaf. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I imagine that maybe some whole leaves might be good, extra good habitat. So kind of balancing those two needs and what's right for your space.
If you run a mower over your leaves, then you're going to cut up the chrysalises and the cocoons that are being wintering in the leaves.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah. There's a question about, are there any concerns about toxins in cardboard glue, ink, or chemical sprays and treatments on cardboard? I know in Lincoln Common Ground, we talk about most people take off any tape or labels if they can before putting it down. In terms of the glue, ink, treatments, I know I personally am a little bit sometimes hesitant about it in the vegetable garden, but in for the flower, but you might want to be a little more picky about, not using colored inks or things with any sort of, sometimes they have, coatings on them. You might want to be a little careful. I don't know if anyone has any other feedback on that, but definitely for the flower gardens, I use a lot of cardboard and it's been working really well. Yeah, I see a question from Mary.
Yeah, I was told for vegetable gardens that it's not good to use cardboard to suppress the weeds, which you just alluded to, because even if you take off all the labels and the tape, there's still something in the cardboard. So that was one comment. But I also wondered if I have a lot of oak leaves on my property, and they're more acidic and they decompose more slowly. So could you just talk about that? I mean, in the vegetable garden, I'm figuring it's not a good place to put them, but could you just talk about oak leaves a little bit?
Sure. And again, I welcome anyone else to jump in, but oak leaves. So oaks are one of the things that I know Doug Ptolemy talks about is they're considered a keystone species. So there's a lot of particularly insects that rely on oak trees. So I would say that if you have a spot under an oak tree where you can just leave the leaves in place and have that, like Isabel said, that soft landing rather than moving them out, if you're comfortable doing that, that can be a really beneficial spot to just leave them in place and have a bit of leaf litter, which might mean that you don't have grass there. So it's what you're comfortable with, but that can be a really important, just sort of right under the tree canopy, leaving them. They are more acidic and they do decompose more slowly. So you could think about before, if you wanted to take some they had blown somewhere else and you didn't want to leave them under the tree, I might put them in the compost and let them sort of mix in with the other nutrients there and decompose some more before putting them into the garden. But there are other people on, I know, who are more experienced gardeners than me who might have other feedback. That was a great question.
Thanks.
Rachel,
Mm-hmm.
it's Robin here.
Yeah.
I mean, my understanding about oak leaves, and from what I know, is that they are not naturally acidic, but what they do is that they create sort of an aerobic situation because there, rain gets through, and so that creates a more acidic situation. So by themselves, they don't make acid soil. But they can create a situation where it's more acidic. But they're great, and I would put them under trees. I'm not sure I would put them in a flower bed or something like that where they would, but they should be fine. I mean, that's what happens in the woods. They should be okay around, particularly under oak trees. It's a great place for them.
Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. I've been really impressed with the Xerces Society. Has a lot of really great information. There are a lot of organizations that have great information. The Xerces Society has some great information on how-tos with Leave the Leaves, which can be a really great resource. I see a question in the chat. I have heard that leaves can cause disease if left around bushes. I haven't heard that unless it means from ticks, if that's the concern. And I know that there's a lot of debate back and forth about ticks and leaving the leaves. Because on one hand, like I said, the biodiversity really helps. And on the other hand, it's sort of a moist, protected environment. And from what I've read, having a really thick leaf litter, you might be a little more likely to have some more ticks. So maybe I'm not sure if you know what disease you've heard or if that's just you've heard more generally, but please, anyone feel free to jump in if you have more information on that. And Terry, I see that you have your hand raised.
I do, and it's kind of silly, but I just feel like you've done a great job. But the bottom line is, as simple as it sounds, just leave the leaves. And so it's kind of like the great takeaway here is it's as simple as it sounds. So if I'm missing that, if I'm missing something, I think there's all these benefits, but I think you've made it clear why we want to do that. So thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and I'll say where my yard is, we don't have a ton of, it's not like heavily wooded. So we just leave the leaves and they kind of blow around and it doesn't hurt the grass and we don't do anything. And it's super easy and it's nice. And I figure they kind of blow into these little areas on the edges and then help the plants and that works really well. So yeah, it is definitely the easier way to go. Thank you.
It's hard to change these aesthetic things and also hard to control people who do landscaping work for people, the people on the mowers with the blowers. And it's just a slow process to change people's ideas about these things, including our own.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why I really like the signs that people have been starting to put up, like the Xerces Society and the ones that we'll have to help just kind of educate people that there's a different way to do things. And I think hopefully once there's a critical mass of people doing it differently, it will start to shift the mindset. But yeah, it is slow.
I have found that because the leaves do blow around, that as I add ground cover, they catch the leaves and let them just hold there. And I've got a huge oak tree, so it's the oak leaves I want to catch because they do have the potential of having over 400 native insects in there to feed the birds in the spring. But I think, I also mix my oak leaves with other leaves so that it becomes a composite. and it helps the oak to decompose.
Great. That's a great tip. Thank you. And I should also say, I should have said when we were talking about this eco gardening, I think I kind of alluded to, but this is all kind of connected with what we talked about. I think many of you were here in the spring with No Mow May, and it's all part of this changing how we garden to think about more ecological gardening methods that help support wildlife and help support the the earth. And planting native plants is another really important piece of that. And the fall, I should say, is an important or a really great time to plant natives. So if you're interested in planting more native plants, another thing you can do is plant some native plants this fall, and then you put some leaves around them as some overwinter mulch. And I see a hand from Mary.
Yeah, this is in a different vein, but I was just thinking that landscapers charge a fortune for spring cleanup and fall cleanup. And so they're going to be out a lot of money when we all start to leave our leaves on the lawn. And I wonder what creative solutions they and we will come up with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know in Lincoln Common Ground, we've wondered that too, because we don't want to put them out of business, and we understand that they need the money, and that is a big source of revenue. I think that having a conversation, if you have a landscaper, with your landscaper about, this is what you want to do, what are other ways you could support them. One idea that I've had, I don't know how interested they are in this, but things like, could they help plant native plants in the fall instead, and you could pay them for that? Or could they help in the spring pull invasives out and you pay for that? So I think there are creative solutions. I think maybe we need to start having those conversations more with landscapers, and start collaborating with them maybe. But I think I like to hope that those creative solutions do exist, and there are ways that they can still have a viable business model and also support this more ecological method of gardening.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great question. Yeah, there's a comment that it costs more to pay for raking. Maybe they could make more money there. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Bryn.
I was just thinking, maybe in that same vein that, Lincoln Common Ground is well poised. You're really trying to be community connectors to start inviting, people to say, oh yeah, my landscaper is willing to do this, and then be able to promote them to this network of people that, are interested in that, to really, help support landscapers who have transitioned to more ecological gardening.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you. And Mary, do you have another question? I see your hand is straight.
Yeah. Oh no, I forgot to lower my hand.
That's fine.
There was so much in what you had to say. I don't know whether it's possible for you to put some of the early slides back on, but the one with the arrows going up and down and where the CO2 goes to, I'm curious to have a chance to look at that a little bit more.
Like this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is all being recorded, and so you'll also have a chance to go back and look at, I think what we've done in the past is made it like available. We'll have a link and it's on YouTube, so you can always fast forward to those slides and spend more time, or I'm happy to share anything.
I wish they would be teaching this in the schools. I mean, my grandchildren who are young are so interested in everything that has to do with how things grow. And
yeah, I think it is becoming more part of the curriculum, but it definitely could be even more. Yeah.
So Rachel, when in the future picture on the right,
Yeah.
when the carbon dioxide is going down into the biosphere, that's because in photosynthesis it gets used?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. This is a very simplified diagram that the one on the left, I just took one that the Department of Energy made and I made it into my own cartoon. And then the one on the right, you'll see I haven't changed the numbers from the pools because there's, you know, different debates with different models about how much potential there is to change these pools. So I just changed the arrows and the width of the arrows to say more in the biosphere, more in the soil. But the idea is with the biosphere, more photosynthesis, exactly. And then with the soil, it would be more organic matter from those plants. So it could be from leaves, it could be from the roots, but more carbon going into the soil from those plants. And this reason that it's really critical that it gets into the soil is not only that the soil is a bigger carbon pool, but also that the carbon stays in the soil for longer. So a tree lives for, I mean, a tree can live for hundreds of years or longer, but a lot of plants, you know, turn over fairly quickly. They grow, they die. In the soil, carbon can last for thousands of years in the soil. Not all of it does, but a significant portion can get locked up in the soil for a long time. So not only is it storing a lot of carbon, but it's storing it there for a good amount of time, which could sort of help us while we're transitioning away from fossil fuels more.
This isn't really about soil, but what's the dynamic with the carbon dioxide going into the ocean? Is it plant life in the ocean that is absorbed?
Yeah. So like phytoplankton, plankton in the ocean that photosynthesize are a huge draw of carbon dioxide. I think the main reason why people are so focused on soil right now is it's easier to manage. We already manage soil a lot through things like farming, forestry, our own yards. Oceans are a little bit harder to manage. And when people have tried doing experiments like adding iron and seeing what it does, it often backfires. So it's a little bit harder, although people are thinking a lot about things like kelp forests in the oceans are really, really important. Also, those do a lot of photosynthesis, the kelp forests, and then they support this huge array of diverse marine life. So the oceans are an even bigger carbon pool. They're really, really important. I know less about them and they're a little bit harder to manage, but they are definitely important. Yeah, Isabel.
I just heard that there's a phenomenal exhibit at the, it used to be the Whaling Museum in New Bedford. It's got a new name, Maritime Museum or something, but it's about seaweed and all of the plant life in the ocean with climate change. It's there, I think, till mid-October or something, but somebody was just raving about how it's just, as a scientist, it's a phenomenal exhibit. So
That
maybe we
sounds
can do a field
fantastic.
trip. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Can you turn off your camera because you're not blurred? Please turn off.
I see a comment about Codman Community Garden where the sunflower stalks have to get knocked down. Definitely, if you're part of Codman Community Garden, you could help with the conversation about why that is and if it's possible for them to stay for this year, if that's not an option. I do know people will just cut off the heads of the sunflowers and put those out for birds. So you don't have the stalk, but at least you have the seeds for birds. And I imagine you'd be able to do that.
I didn't mow a whole back portion of what was my lawn. So I've been wondering what to do about it now. So just leave it there, right? I don't need to cut off the tops of the stuff that's flowered, or do I?
Yeah, so that's such an interesting question. And there are people on here I know who are like, I don't know if Diana is still on, who are bigger experts than I am. There's some debate about if you're going to maintain a meadow, when would you mow and what would that look like? I think the concern is that if you had an area of your yard that you never mowed, it might start to turn back into a forest. You would start to have an ecology you talk about, it's called succession, and you'd have some shrubs starting to come in, and then some fast growing trees starting to come in, and then other trees coming in, and it would turn into forest. And if you're okay with that, then that's fine. If you want it to stay a meadow, I think there has to be some kind of management of it. And there's some debate about the best time to mow, because some people say the fall is a good time to mow, but then, yeah, you're losing those stalks. Some people say the spring is a good time to mow, but then, we know from No Mow May that can be really important for things like native bees and a lot of insects to have that food source and habitat. Maybe the ideal is to mow part of it in the fall and part of it in the spring. There's definitely a lot of different opinions on it, and it might be fine this year, but I think Diana, I don't think does mow. So depending on, you could also just be really good about, if you do see things coming in that you don't want, shrubs and things, you could pull them or cardboard over them if you have a small enough space that you wanted to kind of stay on top of it. But if you don't do anything to it, it will eventually start to turn more into a successional forest. Yeah, I see Sarah's hand.
Oh, thanks. I was just going to say that as part of our pollinator action plan for the renovation we've been doing at Chapman Pasture, ultimately we'd like to only mow like a third, maybe to half of the area at a time each year, so that you always have some stalks that are growing, even if you have to mow part of it.
That's great advice. Thank you. And I see Isabel's hand. Isabel, are you there? And I see Mary's hand.
Yeah.
I didn't get it down.
Yeah.
Can you make my video work? It says you blocked it.
Oh, I don't see your video. I'm not sure. Bryn, do you know if the video is blocked?
Oh, wait.
Yeah, there. It had gotten turned around, so I turned it off.
Thank you.
Thanks. Shall I go, or is someone else going?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I live on the Row Field on Tower Road, and I've lived there for 20 years. So I've had the opportunity to see how the field, there's many diverse plants in that field, and it gets mowed. Sometimes it gets mowed in August, sometimes in September. But the goldenrod, and there's a ton of goldenrod in it, it always comes back. And everything always seems to come back. So it's quite resilient and beautiful.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, and LCT definitely, yeah, have been thinking about this. I know a lot. So I like the idea of being able to mow a little bit at a time, but then have things come back, I think is great. And I see that Diana says that she doesn't mow, but she plans for succession. So yeah, if you're comfortable with succession happening, then that totally works. Maintaining a savanna balance. Cutting woody material. Yeah, and there definitely are different approaches to the meadow of Diana is more like this example where things are sort of planned out in a really beautiful painterly way. And then there's also the just kind of letting it go and have everything come up that comes up. And both are great.
I was surprised to see in a place which I believe has been maintained like a lawn for years, that there were so incredibly many different plants that came up when you didn't mow at all. I mean, dozens. I was out there with my picture this, looking at them all, and I got a long list.
Yeah, we've lived in our house for 2 years now. And right before we moved in, I think about a year before we moved in, they redid the septic system. And so that soil had been disturbed.
Mhm.
And that soil is amazing what comes
Right.
up. Like, I think if anyone has anything where you're disturbing the soil, maybe that's an extra
Mhm.
good time to see. I know a lot of prairie plants like that disturbed soil. We have so many great golden.
That's what happened at my house too. They had to replace, in order to sell it to me, I had to fiddle around with the septic system, and it was a major disruption. So that must be the reason it's got so many different plants.
And the opposite happened to me. I got an infestation of Japanese knotweed.
Dear.
I guess it can go either way. I'm sorry
Right.
you have to deal with Japanese knotweed.
I know. So now the goldenrod is living like right next to the Japanese knotweed. I'm hoping the goldenrod is going to win.
Yeah, I hope so for you. Yeah. Are there any other questions or comments? Well, I so appreciate everyone being here and the fantastic discussion and questions. And if you think of anything else, Lincoln Common Ground, if you go to our website, we have a contact us area. So you can contact us and chat with us about any other questions that come up. And then LLCT, everyone there is definitely an expert and has a lot of experience with ecological management of land. And yeah, we have a lot of experts in town. We're very lucky, I think, here to have a lot of experts who can help answer questions. And hopefully pretty soon we'll start seeing Leave the Leaves signs popping up around Lincoln. Are there any final questions before we end?
Thank you so much. That was great.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rachel. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hope that everyone also, if you have an opportunity, checks out the Garden Club talk, because that on November 7th at 7 should be really wonderful.